The year is 1867, and the location is a dimly lit room in the Russian Foreign Ministry in St. Petersburg. Outside, the wind is howling off the frozen Neva River, but inside the atmosphere is even colder. A group of powerful men, including the Grand Duke Constantine, the brother of the Tsar, are staring at a map of the world. They are looking at a massive yellow stain that covers the top left corner of North America. It is a territory of immense size. It is twice the size of Texas. It is filled with endless forests, towering mountains, and rivers teeming with salmon. It is a land that we now know contains billions of dollars in gold and oil. But these men do not see wealth when they look at this map. They see a liability. They see a trap. They see a mortgage payment that they cannot afford. This territory is Russian America, which we call Alaska. And in a few months, these men will make the decision to sell it for a price that works out to about 2 cents an acre. To the modern observer, this looks like the greatest mistake in the history of real estate. It looks like insanity. Why would an empire sell a continent-sized territory for less than the cost of a few buildings in Manhattan? The answer is not that the Russians were stupid. It is not that they did not know about the potential resources. The answer is that the Russian Empire was bankrupt. This is the story of how a superpower was brought to its knees not by an invading army, but by compound interest. It is the story of how the Crimean War destroyed the Russian treasury and how a secret plan to liquidate a colony became the only way to save the Romanov dynasty from financial collapse. To understand why the Tsar sold Alaska, we have to rewind 11 years to 1856. Russia had just lost the Crimean War. It was a humiliating defeat. For centuries, Russia had been the bogeyman of Europe. It was the land of the endless army. The other powers of Europe feared the Russian bear, but the Crimean War exposed the bear as sick and weak. The British and French armies had invaded Russian soil, and despite fighting on their home turf, the Russians had been beaten. Their rifles were outdated. Their supply lines were non-existent. Their ships were made of wood, while the British ships were made of iron. But the military defeat was nothing compared to the economic disaster. Wars are expensive. To fight the British and French Russia had printed money, millions of rubles. This caused massive inflation. The value of the ruble collapsed. At the same time, they had borrowed heavily from European banks to buy weapons. Now the war was over, but the debt remained. The treasury in St. Petersburg was empty. The interest payments were eating up a huge percentage of the national budget. The new Tsar Alexander II looked at his empire and saw a financial black hole. He knew that if Russia was going to survive, it needed to modernize. It needed to build railroads. It needed to build factories. It needed to abolish serfdom and create a modern economy. All of this required massive amounts of capital, but no one wanted to lend money to a loser. The credit rating of the Russian Empire was in the toilet. The bankers in London and Paris, the Rothschilds and the Barings were wary. They wanted to see stability before they opened their vaults again. This is where Alaska enters the equation. For the Russian government, Alaska was not a prized asset. It was a money pit. The Russian-American Company, which was a state-sponsored corporation similar to the British East India Company, was in charge of the colony. But unlike the East India Company, which was looting India for profit, the Russian-American Company was bleeding cash. The sea otter population, which had been the source of the fur trade, was hunted to near extinction. The company was failing. It required subsidies from the government to keep the lights on. So not only was the Russian government broke, but it was also subsidizing a failing business on the other side of the world. But there was a darker fear than just money. There was the fear of geopolitics. The Grand Duke Constantine was the Tsar's younger brother and the head of the Russian Navy. He was a realist. He looked at the map and he saw a strategic nightmare. Alaska shared a massive border with Canada, and Canada was a British colony. The British Empire was Russia's arch enemy. The British Navy ruled the oceans. The Grand Duke knew that if another war broke out between Russia and Britain, the British Navy would simply sail into the ports of Alaska and take it. Russia had no Pacific fleet strong enough to defend it. They could not send troops across Siberia fast enough. Alaska was defenseless. The Grand Duke wrote a secret letter to the Foreign Minister Alexander Gorchakov. In this letter, he laid out a cold and calculating logic. He said that the United States represents the future of the continent. He said that eventually the United States would want to control all of North America. He argued that if Russia held onto Alaska, they would eventually lose it to the British for nothing. The British would just seize it as a prize of war. It was better, he argued, to sell it to the Americans now, while they could still get some money for it. It was a strategy of cutting losses. It was a fire sale. But there was a problem. The Americans were busy. It was the late 1850s, and the United States was tearing itself apart. The tension between the North and the South was reaching a boiling point. The American government was paralyzed by the debate over slavery. They were not in the mood to buy a frozen wasteland from the Tsar. The Russian ambassador in Washington, a clever and charming man named Edward de Steckel, was told to wait. He was told to keep the idea alive, but to be patient. Then, in 1861, the American Civil War exploded. For 4 years, the United States was engulfed in blood. The sale of Alaska was put on hold. But during this time, something interesting happened. Russia and the United States became best friends. It seems strange today given the Cold War history, but in the 19th century, Russia and America were natural allies. They both hated the British Empire. During the Civil War, Britain and France were secretly flirting with the idea of recognizing the Confederacy. They wanted to see the United States break into two weaker nations, because a united America was a threat to their global dominance. The Tsar Alexander II saw this. He knew that if the Union fell, Britain would become even more powerful. So he made a bold move. He sent the Russian Navy to visit the ports of New York and San Francisco. It was a clear signal to London and Paris. If you intervene in the American Civil War, you will have to fight Russia too. The American public was ecstatic. They threw parades for the Russian sailors. They saw Russia as their only true friend in Europe. This friendship would become the foundation of the Alaska deal. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the Union had triumphed, but the U.S. government was exhausted. They were drowning in their own war debt. The Secretary of State, William Seward, was an expansionist. He believed that it was America's destiny to control the entire continent. He wanted Alaska. He saw it as a bridge to Asia. He saw the potential for trade with China and Japan. But he had a hard time convincing anyone else. The American people were tired of war and spending money. They looked at Alaska and saw a block of ice. The newspapers called it Seward's Folly and Seward's icebox. They mocked him. They asked why he wanted to buy a polar bear garden. Meanwhile, in St. Petersburg, the situation was getting desperate. The Russian treasury was critically low on hard currency. They had significant payments coming due on their foreign loans. The Tsar needed cash, and he needed it fast. He summoned Stuckel back to the Winter Palace. The meeting took place in December of 1866. The Tsar, the Grand Duke, the Foreign Minister, and the Finance Minister were present. The Finance Minister, Reutern, was the most anxious man in the room. He presented the ledger. It was bleeding red ink. He told the Tsar that even a small sum from the sale of Alaska would help stabilize the ruble and pay the interest on the Rothschild loans. They decided on a price. They would ask for $5 million. But they authorized Stuckel to negotiate. They told him to get as much as he could, but the priority was to close the deal. They needed the money by the next fiscal quarter. Stuckel was given his marching orders. He traveled back to Washington, D.C., carrying the secret offer in his pocket. He was a diplomat, but he was about to become a salesman. Stuckel arrived in Washington in March of 1867. He went straight to William Seward. He found a receptive audience. Seward was eager. He wanted a victory to distract the public from the messy aftermath of the Civil War and the impending impeachment of President Andrew Johnson. Seward and Stuckel began a game of poker. Stuckel started high. Seward started low. They haggled over the price of a continent. But Stuckel had a secret weapon. He knew that Seward wanted this deal more than the American Congress did. He knew that Seward was vain and wanted to leave a legacy. Finally, they agreed on a price. $7.2 million. It was more than the Russians had expected. The extra $200,000 was added to cover the cost of the existing Russian infrastructure in the colony. But there was a catch. The deal had to be signed immediately. Stuckel wanted to send the telegram to the Tsar before the American Congress could wake up and block it. The story of the signing is legendary. It was the night of March 29, 1867. Stuckel went to Seward's house in the evening to tell him that the Tsar had given his approval by telegraph. Stuckel suggested they meet the next day to sign the treaty. Seward pushed away his card game and stood up. He said, "Why wait until tomorrow? Let us make the treaty tonight." Stuckel was surprised. He said, "But your department is closed? You have no clerks?" Seward smiled and said, "If you can muster your legation by midnight, you will find me awaiting you at the Department of State." So in the middle of the night, the Russian diplomats and the American officials gathered at the State Department. The clerks were dragged out of bed. The gas lamps were lit. They worked feverishly to draft the final treaty. Maps were spread out on the tables. The boundaries were drawn. The fate of the indigenous people of Alaska, the Tlingit, the Haida, the Aleut, was decided without a single one of them being present. They were transferred from one empire to another, like livestock. The treaty stated that the inhabitants of the ceded territory would be admitted to the enjoyment of all the rights, advantages, and immunities of citizens of the United States. But this promise would be broken for a century. At 4 o'clock in the morning on March 30th, the treaty was signed. Seward had bought an empire the size of Western Europe for less than 2 cents an acre. He was jubilant. He thought he had secured the safety of America. Stuckel was relieved. He had secured the liquidity of the Romanov dynasty. He sent a telegram to St. Petersburg that simply said, "Treaty signed, $7.2 million. But the drama was not over. Signing a treaty is one thing. Paying for it is another. The United States Congress had to approve the money, and the Congress was in a foul mood. The House of Representatives was controlled by men who hated President Johnson, and by extension hated his Secretary of State, William Seward. They saw the purchase as a waste of money and a way to expand the power of an unpopular administration. They threatened to block the appropriation of funds. This is where the story shifts from high diplomacy to low corruption. Stuckel realized that the deal was in danger. He had promised the Tsar the money. If he went back to Russia empty-handed, he would be disgraced. So he did what any desperate lobbyist would do. He resorted to bribery. The Russian government authorized a secret slush fund. Stuckel began to wine and dine the influential congressman. He hired powerful lobbyists. He placed favorable articles in the newspapers. Thousands of dollars in gold were handed out in brown paper envelopes. The Russian ambassador, the representative of the autocrat, was buying American democracy. It is estimated that over $100,000 of the purchase price was actually used to bribe the U.S. Congress to vote for the purchase. It was a dirty deal done in the shadows, but it worked. The House of Representatives finally voted to approve the funds. The check was cut. The transfer of the money was a complex financial operation. The U.S. Treasury issued a warrant for $7.2 million. But Russia didn't want dollars. They wanted gold, and they wanted it in London. The warrant was given to the Russian legation, who then deposited it in a U.S. bank. The bank then worked with the Rothschilds to transfer the value to London, where it was converted into gold bullion and deposited into the accounts of the Russian government. The money did not go to build schools or hospitals in Russia. It went almost immediately to pay the interest on the foreign railroad loans. The sale of Alaska essentially paid the mortgage for the Russian railway system for a few more years. On October 18, 1867, the official transfer ceremony took place in Sitka, Alaska. It was a somber affair. Russian troops lined up on one side of the flagpole and American troops on the other. The Russian flag was lowered, but it got stuck. A sailor had to climb up the pole to cut it loose. It fell down and landed on the Russian bayonets. It was seen as a bad omen. The American flag was raised. Alaska was now American soil. Most of the Russians living in Alaska packed their bags and left. They did not want to live under American rule. The indigenous people looked on with confusion and dread. They had not been conquered. They had not sold their land. But suddenly they had new masters who spoke a new language and brought new laws. For the first few decades, it seemed like the critics were right. Alaska was ignored. It was governed by the military, then by the Treasury Department. It was a lawless frontier. The American public forgot about it. It seemed that Russia had pulled off a great scam. They had sold a useless block of ice to gullible Americans. The $7 million was spent and gone. The Tsar had his railroad. The Americans had their icebox. But history has a way of playing tricks on the short-sighted. In 1896, almost 30 years after the sale, a prospector in the Yukon found a nugget of gold the size of a thumb. The news spread like wildfire. The Klondike Gold Rush began. Thousands of men rushed north. Millions of dollars in gold were pulled from the rivers and mountains of Alaska. In just a few years, the United States made back the purchase price of Alaska 100 times over. And then came the oil. In the 20th century, massive oil fields were discovered in Prudhoe Bay. The strategic value of Alaska became incalculable during the Cold War. It was the first line of defense against the very country that had sold it. Soviet bombers were intercepted over the airspace that their grandfathers had sold for pennies. The radar stations that protected the United States were built on land that was bought to pay off a bad debt. In the end, the sale of Alaska is a lesson in the dangers of short-term thinking. The Russian Empire was so focused on its immediate cash flow problems on its next quarterly debt payment that it sold off its future. They traded a continent for a few years of solvency. They feared losing the territory to Britain, so they gave it to America, never realizing that America would become the rival that eventually buried them. As we end the first part of this script, we have seen the sale itself. We have seen the desperate men in St. Petersburg and the midnight dealings in Washington. We have seen the money change hands. But there is another layer to this story. A layer that involves the specific role of the financial dynasties of Europe and the hidden mechanisms of how empires go bankrupt. In the second part, we will dive deeper into the financial mechanics of the Russian collapse. We will look at how the Rothschilds squeezed the Tsar. We will look at the internal Russian debate that was silenced. And we will see how the money from Alaska was not the salvation the Tsar hoped for, but merely a temporary bandage on a wound that would eventually kill the empire. The transfer of Alaska was complete on paper, but the ghost of the deal continued to haunt the Russian Empire. To understand the true depth of this tragedy for Russia, we have to look away from the map of North America and look at the ledgers of the Imperial Ministry of Finance in St. Petersburg. The sale of Alaska was not an isolated real estate transaction. It was a symptom of a terminal illness that was rotting the Romanov dynasty from the inside out. That illness was debt dependency. The Russian Empire in the 19th century was a paradox. It was the largest continuous land empire in history. It had the largest army. It had immense natural resources. But financially, it was a third world country. It had almost no middle class. It had almost no domestic capital. If the Tsar wanted to build a bridge or a cannon or a palace, he had to borrow the money from London or Paris or Berlin. Russia was the world's largest debtor. The Crimean War had blown a hole in the budget that was impossible to fill. But the Tsar Alexander II had a vision. He wanted to industrialize. He looked at Britain and saw the power of the steam engine. He realized that the source of British power was not just the navy, but the factory. He launched a massive program of railroad construction. He wanted to connect the grain fields of the Ukraine with the ports of the Baltic. He wanted to connect the mines of the Urals with the factories of Moscow. This was a noble goal, but the execution was a financial disaster. The Russian government guaranteed the loans for private railroad companies. This meant that if the railroad went bust, the government would pay the investors. It was a massive subsidy for incompetence and corruption. The railroad barons took the money, built shoddy tracks, and pocketed the difference. The state was left holding the bag. By 1866, the year before the Alaska sale, the Russian government was spending almost a third of its entire budget just servicing the debt on these railroad loans. This is where the House of Rothschild enters the story. The Rothschilds were the bankers of Europe. They had branches in London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. They were the masters of the bond market. When a government needed money, they went to the Rothschilds. The relationship between the Tsar and the Rothschilds was complicated. The Romanovs were autocrats. They were anti-Semitic. They despised the idea of being beholden to Jewish bankers. But they had no choice. The Rothschilds were the only ones with deep enough pockets to keep the Russian Empire afloat. In the years leading up to the sale of Alaska, the Rothschilds were putting pressure on the Russian finance ministry. They were worried about the stability of the ruble. They wanted the Russian government to build up its gold reserves to back the currency. They warned that if the reserves dropped too low, the interest rates on future loans would skyrocket. The Tsar was trapped. He could not stop building railroads because that would mean admitting that Russia was no longer a great power. But he could not afford to pay for them. The $7.2 million from Alaska was a drop in the bucket compared to the total debt. But it was a critical injection of hard currency at a moment of panic. It was liquidity. It allowed the finance minister Reutern to show the European bankers that Russia still had cash coming in. It allowed them to refinance their loans at a slightly better rate. In essence, Alaska was sold to improve the credit score of the Russian Empire. It was a payday loan taken out by a superpower. There were voices in Russia that opposed the sale. There were patriots and visionaries who saw the potential of the Pacific. They argued that Russia should pivot to the east. They argued that the future of the world lay in the Pacific Ocean, not the Atlantic. They pointed out that Alaska was rich in furs and fish and potentially minerals. They said that giving up territory was a sign of weakness that would encourage Russia's enemies. But these voices were silenced. The Grand Duke Constantine and the finance minister Reutern controlled the Tsar's ear. They argued that Russia needed to consolidate. They used the word concentration. They said Russia should focus on its core interests in Europe and Central Asia. They argued that Alaska was a distraction, a luxury they could not afford. They painted a picture of a defenseless colony that was costing them money every year. They manipulated the data to make the Russian-American company look even worse than it was. They suppressed reports about gold being found in the rivers of Alaska. They wanted the deal to go through, and they did not want facts to get in the way. The tragedy is that they were wrong about almost everything. They were wrong about the defensibility of Alaska. If they had kept it and populated it, it would have been a fortress. They were wrong about the economic potential, and they were wrong about the geopolitical friendship with America. They believed that by selling Alaska to the United States, they would cement a permanent alliance against Britain. They thought the Americans would be grateful. They thought the Americans would help them in their rivalry with London. But gratitude is not a concept in geopolitics. Once the Americans had Alaska, they no longer needed Russia. In fact, the purchase of Alaska made America a Pacific power, which eventually brought it into conflict with Russia's interests in Asia. By the 20th century, the friendship was dead. The two nations were enemies, and the land that Russia sold to buy a few years of financial breathing room became the forward operating base of their greatest adversary. The money itself vanished quickly. The $7 million was absorbed into the general treasury. It was used to buy railroad equipment from abroad. Ironically, much of that equipment was bought from Britain and America, so the money went right back to the countries that were Russia's rivals. The railroad tracks were laid, but the underlying problem of the Russian economy, the lack of efficiency, the corruption, the backwardness remained. The sale of Alaska did not save the Romanovs. It merely delayed the inevitable collapse. 50 years after the sale in 1917, the Russian Empire finally ran out of time and money. The debts piled up until they were unpayable. The First World War broke the back of the economy. The Tsar was forced to abdicate. The Bolsheviks took power. One of the first things the new Soviet government did was default on all the foreign debts of the Russian Empire. They told the Rothschilds and the French banks that they would not pay a single kopeck. The financial house of cards that Alexander II had tried to save by selling Alaska finally fell down. In the Soviet era, the sale of Alaska became a taboo subject. The communists did not want to talk about how the Tsars had given away Soviet territory, but there was a lingering sense of bitterness, a feeling that Russia had been swindled. There were rumors and myths that spread among the Russian people. Some people believed that Alaska was not sold, but leased for 99 years, and that the Americans refused to give it back. Some believed that the ship carrying the gold from London sank and the money never arrived. These myths were false, but they reflected a deep psychological wound, a sense of loss. Today, when you look at the Bering Strait, you see a narrow stretch of water that separates two worlds. On one side is Chukotka, a remote and impoverished region of Russia. On the other side is Alaska, a wealthy and strategic state of the USA. The contrast is stark. Alaska has the Trans-Alaska Pipeline carrying billions of barrels of oil. It has major military bases. It has a thriving fishing industry. It is a strategic asset of the highest order. For modern Russia, the sale of Alaska is the ultimate what if. What if the Tsar had held on? What if he had listened to the dissenters? What if the Russian flags still flew over Juneau and Anchorage? The Cold War would have looked very different. The history of the 20th century would have been rewritten. Russia would have had a foothold in North America. The Soviet Union might have placed missiles not in Cuba, but in their own territory in North America. The geopolitical balance of the world would have been shifted on its axis. But history is written by the decisions made in desperate rooms by desperate men. The decision to sell Alaska was made by men who were looking at a balance sheet that was bleeding red. They were not thinking about the next century. They were thinking about the next loan payment. They were victims of the short term, thinking that plagues all declining empires. They sacrificed the eternal for the temporary. The story of the purchase of Alaska is usually told as an American success story, Seward's folly becoming Seward's triumph. But it is perhaps more important to tell it as a Russian tragedy. It is the story of how debt enslaves nations. It is the story of how financial weakness leads to territorial disintegration. The Russian Empire did not lose Alaska on the battlefield. They lost it at the bank. The Rothschilds did not seize the territory, but their invisible hand forced the pen of the Tsar. So the next time you see a map of North America and you see that giant peninsula reaching out from the continent towards Asia, remember that it is not just a piece of land. It is a monument to a bankruptcy. It is the receipt for a bill that a dying empire could not pay. It is the proof that in the game of empires, the most dangerous weapon is not a cannon or a rifle, but a promissory note. And the most dangerous defeat is not losing a war, but running out of gold. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming. Don't forget to subscribe. Join those who see what others won't.